Hi, and welcome to Bookends. I'm Mattea Roach. I want you to visualize $1 million. What would that look like for you? Maybe $1 million gets you a home in Toronto or Vancouver, or a really rare piece of art to put in your home. How about a live-in chef or a nanny for you and your kids, or a lavish White Lotus-type vacation? The point is, I think we all have some idea of what $1 million could possibly get us. But what happens if you try to visualize $1 billion? If you're anything like me, that's almost impossible to do. $1 billion is too abstract. It's too big to really wrap your head around. I had this in mind when I picked up Rumaan Alam's latest novel. It's called Entitlement, and it's about a young Black woman who's been tasked with helping an older white man give away his several billions of dollars. Entitlement explores the influence of money, who has it, who needs it, and how it shapes our thinking around class, privilege, and power. And like all of Rumaan's work, it asks a lot of questions while also challenging readers to come up with their own answers. I spoke to Rumaan Alam late last year, and he joined me from his home in Brooklyn. Hi, Rumaan. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy that you, as I, have trouble understanding the difference between $1 billion and $1 million. The rhyme really obscures the logic there. You know, $1 billion is a lot more than $1 million. It's not sequential the way that it sounds like it might be.
I want to start by asking about the title of this new book, Entitlement, which I think is also really the theme of the novel in many respects. It's a bold choice. It certainly makes a statement, and there are multiple ways you could interpret the title. I'm wondering what inspired this title and what inspired you to write this book at this moment?
The title of this novel was extremely hard to arrive at, actually. I had the whole novel written before I sort of landed on entitlement as the kind of the single word that would sort of distill what the book is talking about. What I like about it as a title, though, is the word's elasticity. Entitlement, of course, sounds one way to the reader. It sounds like the novel is going to engage in a conversation that I think is one we're having in a lot of corners of the culture right now about privilege and about, a kind of the attitude of the individual. Entitlement in the West, though, also has this other connotation of social welfare. Welfare programs, state welfare programs are often sort of talked about in policy language as entitlement programs, which I think is so interesting because it is as though the state is acknowledging there is a human entitlement to shelter and food, for example. But those entitlements to shelter and food are not actually enshrined in law. And all you need to do is visit any major metropolitan area in which houses, as you've already pointed out, cost about $1 million. And you will see people, citizens of that state, who are not availed of the human entitlement to shelter, let alone food. So I think that entitlement has this kind of funny breadth where it seems like it's talking about the individual attitude, but is also talking about something bigger. And that is what I liked about it. And it feels a bit like a litmus test to me for the reader.
Yeah, there's very different connotations that I would say are somewhat like positive and negative, right?
Yeah.
In the sense of if you're entitled to something as a right, that's a positive thing for you to have that thing to which you are entitled, right? But then I think the way that I most commonly hear the word used is mostly older people describing millennials and Gen Z now that Gen Z is entering adulthood as like these entitled young people think that things should be handed to them. And I feel like we definitely see both versions of entitlement at work in your novel. Speaking of kind of inspirations for this novel, I understand that The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath was actually hugely important for you in writing Entitlement.
That's right.
You actually include in the acknowledgement section this line, "Sincere apologies to Sylvia Plath." Why?
I do.
Yeah, why the apology?
Well, the first line of Entitlement is a direct echo maybe you could less charitably say ripoff of the first line of Sylvia Plath's novel, The Bell Jar, the only novel that she finished in her very short lifetime, and a pretty extraordinary book. Entitlement, as I had always conceived it, was a book about a woman, a young woman, having a kind of experience of losing hold of reality in New York City. The Bell Jar is maybe the classic example of a novel about a young woman losing hold of reality in New York City in a previous generation. There is a way of thinking about the bell jar as dramatizing what we now know as Plath's experience of medical crisis. Part of the reason that novel remains a classic, I think, is that it kind of asks the reader whether madness is not the only logical response to the conditions of being a young woman in mid-century life. The protagonist's madness is medical, but the conditions of her life are so constrained by these really noxious forces of misogyny that her madness kind of feels understandable. Entitlement is a book that kind of plays with this question of madness, and I hope that it is a madness that feels, as it does in Plath's book, logical.
Mm. Yeah, I want to talk about the main character of Entitlement, Brooke Orr. She's a Black woman in her 30s who seems kind of like lost in life. She doesn't really have a vocation in her career. She's had a privileged upbringing, but privileged in the sense that she can't just like not work and skate off of her parents' wealth.
Right.
And she does sort of, I think, lose her grip on reality as we follow her through the course of the novel. But I want to ask, like, who is she at the start of the book? Where do we meet her? And what conditions is she living in that enable this kind of slide into madness that you're describing?
Even in your introduction to this person, you pointed out that she's lost hold of a sense of self because she doesn't have a fixed vocation, which is so interesting to me because so much of contemporary life, the identity is so closely associated with the profession. You are what you do. If you don't do, then who are you? That is part of Brooke's problem. She's had a kind of abortive career working as an educator. She has great privilege in the way that I have great privilege. She's educated, she has her health, she's a solidly middle class person. It's not the kind of cartoonish wealth that would allow her to just an adulthood of being a dilettante. She could just sort of collect art and, go shopping all day. She has to have a profession. And in part, it's because of the imperatives of money, right? You have to have a job to pay your rent. But in part, it's because you need to have a sense of who you are. And that is how you define who you are in our culture, by what you do. And that eludes Brooke. And I think that that creates the conditions in which she kind of realizes over the course of the book how little she understands precisely who she is.
Yeah, it feels like she's a character who's kind of ideally positioned to slip into behaviors that I found sometimes very difficult to understand because she is a little bit personally unmoored. I think
Yeah.
also like unmoored in the relationships that she does have, right? She has these friends who one of them has a very stable job that he's kind of locked into. She has another friend who's a lot wealthier than she is and so can just kind of be a dilettante and dabble. She doesn't have like a large extended family, like all of these sorts of things that I think might kind of give you a sense of identity. If you don't have that like locked in career, she sort of doesn't really seem to have.
I like that kind of character. I'm drawn to that kind of person who feels slightly unknowable. What you're saying, and what I think is very common, is that you sort of understand who other people are via their network of what they do for a living, who their family is, what those things tell you about how that person is situated in the society as a whole. Brooke is, in fact, named after the novelist Anita Brookner, who wrote about women, mostly women, who didn't really fit anywhere. They were women who were kind of romantically isolated and sexually isolated, who had small families, who often had lost parents, and their parents were their only tether to reality. Those people exist. People don't have to have large families and large connections to extant networks to exist. And I find those kind of people very alluring as fiction because people are so baffling to me. And the way Brooke behaves in this novel is a little baffling. But that to me is what feels most realistic on the page when somebody behaves counter to the way you might or counter to the way you would expect them to. Because I think that is what people do. They don't really behave the way we expect them to.
Mm. I think, outside of Brooke and her kind of circle, it almost felt to me while reading that the city of New York was a bit a character in this novel in the sense of a lot of these behaviors and sorts of social interactions that I, as somebody who's only ever visited New York, might find kind of baffling, I kind of think can only happen in New York, where there's such class disparities colliding within one city. The bell jar, as you were saying, that's such an inspiration for this novel is also about the sort of chaos of modernity, obviously decades ago in New York. New York figures so heavily in a lot of the books and television and films and just everything that I consume. What is it about the city that makes it a good backdrop for so much fiction and so much introspection about a wide array of topics?
It's a sort of physically constrained space in which one can find almost everything. That is sort of the appeal of New York City, is that it's very tiny, but also vast. The whole world is here. I do think my experience of life here, and it's not limited to New York. There are many cities where this is possible, but you can encounter someone so different from you. And what this book dramatizes is these two people who are quite different from one another, crossing paths very organically. And that feels to me like a New York story. It's possible in London, it's possible in Toronto, it's possible in Moscow. Like there are a million cities where this is possible. But I guess New York is just what I know.
Yeah, I mean, the central narrative tension in this novel does come from, as you say, this like crossing of paths between people that are so different. Brooke, at the beginning of this book, has just begun this kind of new era in her career. She's landed a job at this foundation in Manhattan that was established by this white billionaire who's in his early mid-80s named Asher Jaffe. And the premise is like he wants to give away a bunch of his money before he dies because he only has so long left to live. And so this conceit lets the novel explore how money works and functions kind of at different levels, and specifically at this level where people are billionaires, they have so much money, it's almost completely meaningless to them, right? Or it has a very different meaning than what it would have to you or I. I know recently you were interviewed in The Guardian and you were talking about secret money, the fact that a lot of people have secret money, and when you uncover it, it can kind of make you a bit crazy. I'm wondering where this fascination with these secret layers of money comes from, and whether that's maybe tied to some of these experiences you were talking about of living in New York and kind of having this outsider's view almost when you first arrived of like, oh, this is how things work in the city.
It probably is a kind of narrow personal interest, my attention or awareness to money and its kind of stealth power in the lives of people who are my peers. But this is extant, I think, in so much of life. You're part of a community and you sort of think of all members of that community as being like you. And you go to your kid's friend's birthday party, and you can tell by going into the home that this family has a lot more money than you. Or you could tell by going into the home that the family has old money, which is also a different kind of meaning and a different kind of power. I don't know why I'm interested in that. I think it's so counter to the American mythology of all of us being created equally. It's like it's impolite to talk about, and I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the ways in which it's impolite to acknowledge the function of money in our own lives and in the lives of our peers, and yet we become attuned to reading it. We understand what it means when we see it, and yet we know it is not to be said.
There's an interesting dynamic as well with Brooke's understanding of race and identity, having been the only Black person in her family, right? Because she has this white mom, and then her adopted brother is actually also white. And I feel like this is something that really also seems to motivate a lot of her behavior throughout the book, as she recognizes that in many ways race affects her life and her life chances, but she's the only person in her family who experiences that. And so there's almost this sort of sense of, well, why shouldn't I get ahead? I'm wondering if I'm reading that right, or what you were trying to do in this novel with regards to race and with regards to Brooke's understanding of it specifically.
Even a text that declines to address race is in some ways talking about it, right? So if everyone in the book were white, it would be simply communicating a different story about race. Brooke is Black, and that is sort of, it's such a specific choice, especially as I am not Black, nor am I a woman, right? So to make the protagonist of my book someone who is so far from my own experience of life is clearly a very specific choice. To think of it as sort of like fiction, as a game, I thought that this book would be most persuasive if the elements in play were these opposites. Brooke is a woman, and Asher, her boss, is a man. Brooke is young, she's 33, and Asher, her boss, is 83. He's old enough to be her grandfather. Asher is rich at a kind of astronomical scale. And to me, and the book argues this at one point, Brooke is the opposite of that. Because poor is not really the opposite of rich. The opposite of rich, in the logic of this novel, is middle class. And so what that sort of says is that Asher is liberated from caring about money because he possesses so much of it. And Brooke is oppressed by the idea of money because she doesn't possess quite enough, but she does have the knowledge of what money could provide for her. I do think the book is trying to prod its reader into asking questions about race and the significance of the choice to make Brooke a Black woman. And one of the most interesting things a reader has said to me is another writer I know, who is himself a Black writer, said to me, there's a scene in Entitlement where Brooke is arguing with her boss about a painting by Helen Frankenthaler. And this colleague of mine said to me, I'm not sure I've ever read a contemporary novel in which a Black woman is going on at length about a work of modern art. And he found that very surprising. And I was really thrilled by that observation because I want her to feel as real as, someone on the page is ever going to feel. But I also want her to feel like it's not easy to resolve what that means. That this character who we meet on the page, who we understand as Black, both conforms to and pushes against whatever preconceptions we bring to the reading of a character who is Black, which is what we do on the page. And it is also what we do every day in life. That the way in which race affects everything in society includes our individual experience of reading a book.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. It was very thoughtful, and I think definitely gives me food for thought of how I read a book like this that does have these kind of unresolved questions of how am I intended to respond to it. Asher was such an interesting character to me. We do inhabit his perspective for large chunks of the novel. And he's really consumed by legacy in his twilight years. And he wants to divest a lot of his fortune, but kind of goes back and forth on how much of it to divest, doesn't totally know what he wants to do with it, which is kind of what Brooke's job is to help him figure that out. Can you describe how you got into that mindset of a person who literally has more money than they know what to do with? Because that's something that most of us never experience.
Yeah, but we've all played that game, right? When you see the billboard that says the lottery is $180 million, whatever, we've all played that game. Oh, what would I do? What would I do with all of that money? It was great fun to write about Asher's material possessions or the kind of friction-free experience of life he has. So there's a scene where Asher is up early in the morning and opens the refrigerator and finds all of these things that his private chef has left for him. That's my fantasy. The fantasy that I would be so wealthy and so coddled that I would open the fridge at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there would be a bowl of strawberries, and there would be these like incredible vegan muffins that were actually good for me, just waiting for me. And that I could eat the muffin at the table and leave the crumbs everywhere because it would not matter. Somebody would come along and clean up after me. The more specific it is, the more plausible it feels. And Asher to me feels plausible and specific when he's just an old man eating a vegan muffin in the 5 o'clock hour in his mansion in Connecticut. That feels possible.
I want to ask a little bit about how your upbringing and kind of early, whether that's childhood or early adulthood, maybe has seeped its way into your fiction. I know you were born in the US, but your parents emigrated from Bangladesh to the United States in the early 70s. My understanding is you grew up upper middle class in a suburb of Washington, D.C. that would have been mostly white at the time. I also read this incredible story about you moving to New York with like $300 and a bottle of cologne, which I think is a very particular way to enter New York. Definitely very different than entering from Connecticut with a lot of money.
Right.
I'm wondering how this upbringing and maybe some of those early adulthood experiences of having to really hustle in the city have informed and shaped some of your fiction.
Yeah, I did have to hustle. I did have to land on my feet, but also I would point out that like I had this expensive education at my back, right? And so I had a kind of wealth. I couldn't pay my rent with that necessarily, but it enabled me to do so much more. So I'm not an up by the bootstraps striver, to be clear. I think it's more fair to say, as someone who is not Black and is not white, and is middle class, my particular perspective is not necessarily represented in my fiction. My fiction is about the extremes of American life in some ways, and is also about the sort of types of American who are acceptable to write about or make art about, who are far from my own experience of life. Part of it is that I think because I am different, right? Like I am of South Asian descent. I'm not poor, but I'm not super rich. I don't know. There's something about the way that I was able to float through life that to me has been a gift for my fiction. I often feel that I'm very unnoticed. I feel kind of invisible in a way that I sort of relish. And part of that is maybe just living in New York City where everyone is sort of invisible. There are too many people here. And so even like sometimes you see very famous people like riding the subway or sitting in a coffee shop, and they're just kind of invisible here, which is one of the great pleasures of living here, I think. But this particular sense of myself as I mean, I'm reluctant to say outsider because that sounds so extreme, but I do think I am slightly outside. I'm outside of something. I don't know what it is, but I am on the outside. I did have this sort of very comfortable upper middle class upbringing, but my parents are immigrants and could never be truly American in the way that my American friends' parents were. And that established a sense of remove. And I think that that is kind of proven to me very useful.
I want to return to the question of money in this novel and almost the theme of entitlement, let's say. There's this point in Entitlement where Brooke tells Asher that she doesn't need his money. And he replies, the question is whether or not you deserve it, and kind of flips it. This idea of almost a prosperity gospel kind of logic, this notion that the people who are the most deserving will necessarily do the best financially, that definitely looms large in this book. It's not religious in this book, but it's there. Was this idea of like tying wealth to moral desert something that you were interested in and thinking about while putting this together?
I think that people would be discomfited to realize the extent to which they believe that there is some relationship between the possession of wealth and the possession of sort of moral standing. When you see, as you do in any metropolitan area in this hemisphere, probably, people in crisis, real crisis, sleeping on the train in the subway station, to survive that kind of experience, the rest of us kind of tune it out. We sort of filter it out of our reality. We don't quite see it. Most of us want to believe, and probably do believe, or feel empathy. Oh, this person has a disease. They have had a hard go at life, and I feel for them. Maybe I will even feel enough for them to give them $5. Beneath that, I do think there is a very ugly idea that is baked into us from the time we are very small that somehow if you have ended up on the streets, there is some moral failing. It's just so connected to the American idea of the person and that you can possess kind of the moral high ground and that rich people do. I don't know how else to account for the fact that we as a culture trust the very rich. It doesn't really make any sense. Simply because you've amassed a fortune in one area doesn't make you a political leader, certainly. But look at our contemporary politics. Trump will assume office again with this idea that he has been a success in business, therefore he must know something. There's a feeling of trust in him by some in the electorate that's related to his possession of money. I don't know what to think about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like on both ends of the spectrum, wealth-wise, right? This idea that we almost like can't tolerate the idea that we could live in a society that would allow good people to become so impoverished that they can't afford shelter, or that would allow bad people, and I'm using some air quotes around good and bad, because like what does that mean anyway? We all have different ideas about what that is. But that would allow bad people to amass such a fortune that they can live in incredible comfort. I think that a lot of where this desire to find moral failing in the poor comes from is this idea of like, well, that could never happen to me. It's a way that people almost protect themselves. Or if you're somebody who is living a little bit precariously, there's this intense fear of like, I can't let that happen to me. I can't slip. That seems to be the real mentality and mindset that we see with Brooke over the course of this novel, that she's living in a very particular time and place. It's like 2014. She's in Manhattan. Everything is incredibly expensive. And so much of her motivation is really, she really wants to own an apartment. She wants to have her claws in something that she can call hers, that she, I think, feels is going to save her from whatever kind of slide into poverty she seems to be really afraid she's going to experience. I'm wondering to what extent her behavior is specifically fueled by her proximity to Asher, as opposed to just the general financial malaise that a lot of people seem to experience living in her kind of situation in an urban environment, struggling to find an apartment that you can afford.
I would go further than that and say, in the logic of the culture in which we live, if you don't own an apartment by the time you're in your 30s, you have failed some test of adulthood. This is a logic that was established in a previous generation when that equation was slightly simpler. Nevertheless, it is a very persistent and persuasive thing. And I know a lot of people who struggle with this, who have a ton, have great education, great career, great families, and still feel that this sort of barrier to the real estate market specifically represents a kind of failing, as though one's development as a psyche, as a human being, had any relationship to what you can buy. It obviously doesn't. We know that. And yet, in this country, I'm sure in Canada as well, this is a very persuasive foundational myth. When the conditions change, as they are now, because I know many people who are full adults who are, we began this conversation talking about entitlement as a kind of generational barb, right? But we are not talking, when you speak of millennials now, we are not talking about high schoolers. We're talking about people who have children. You know, what an older generation may perceive as entitlement, this generation's entitlement to work or professional advancement or material good, is in the reckoning of the millennial generation, I think, they simply want to meet the benchmarks of adulthood as they have understood them. And if they cannot participate fully in the economy, which they can't because the logic of the economy is so warped, they feel a personal feeling. And I felt this. And that is really noxious. That is not a good sentiment. And yet, I really believe that is true. I really think that people feel that way.
I think, there is this derangement that we see Brooke and to a lesser extent other characters fall into over the course of Entitlement that is driven by just the sort of absurdity of the situation that, like Brooke, the character, we don't see this in the novel, but realistically would be one of the people who's being yelled at for buying avocado toast. And shouldn't you be spending all of your, shouldn't you never have a single nice pleasure until you own a home? And, gets yelled at some point for not wanting to have children. Like, this is a big thing, that she doesn't want to marry and have children and kind of just wants to enjoy her life. This is seen as a real black mark against her.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the novel, about wealth in our society generally. One thing that you've mentioned a couple of times over the course of our conversation is kind of this idea of not wanting to be didactic, not wanting to tell answers to the reader and to leave certain things open to interpretation. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe think more broadly about fiction and what the point is of reading and writing fiction. What do you think the role is of the novel to convey perspective or like tell truths about the world or provoke thought in the reader? Like, what is the point of all this for you?
Oh, yeah, I think it's the latter. I think it's novelists as a category, at least the ones that I know, are not privy to some knowledge that eludes the rest of us. The skill set of the novelist, I think, is in devising these little machines that prod us to think. To entertain us, yes, that is principle among the forms of objectives, but that it can leave you with something to think about. I don't think good art necessarily possesses answers. I think it provokes questions. And that is what I love about art, is that you can argue about it endlessly. Where you can get as an individual can be to an answer. It may not be the answer that the novelist, whether it's Louise Erdrich or Cormac McCarthy or Colson Whitehead, it's like it may not be what they wanted you to get to, but that doesn't make it invalid. And that's what I love about it. There's something analogous. I mean, there is an abstract painting that's sort of prominent in this book by Helen Frankenthaler. And I think a lot about painting, and there was something about painting that I finally realized for myself, which is that you can go look at a Helen Frankenthaler right now at most museums in the West and say, wow, that yellow reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen, and have this like personal emotional response to it that the artist could never have foreseen and may well think is incorrect. But she's dead, so it doesn't matter. You possess that experience, and that is incredible to me. That is the value of looking at a painting or reading a book, that it can sort of sharpen how you think about something. And money is something I think about, and something that I think we all think about. And what I hope Entitlement can accomplish is forcing you to think a little more deeply or articulate precisely what you think. And, just to ask yourself some question beyond where you normally go about your own relationship to the question of money, or a host of other questions, really.
Rumaan, thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a joy talking with you.
Thank you so much. It was so fun.
Rumaan Alam is the author of Entitlement. He joined me from his home in Brooklyn. This episode was produced by Ryan B. Patrick with help from Barb Carey. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out also to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, as well as the rest of the CBC Books team. It's a collective effort that makes this show possible every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.